Hello. Hi, we're covering World War II today. And what I wanted to do with the discourse is have it so that it is tied to a theme. And that theme is the Catholic Church, a Dutch humanist named Hugo Grotius, and their notions of a just war. What constitutes a righteous, just war? So, Lisa, do you have any questions or comments before we begin?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, you got it. All right, so I want to go ahead and get right into the material. So I'll share the screen with the assignment with you. Try to move it up to where it belongs. All right. So you get a brief introduction on just war doctrine in the opening section. And so notice it's not an argumentative section to analyze or evaluate, but it gives the basics, from what I understand, of just war doctrine. And with just war doctrine, right, it's the notion of justifying war in its origins, at least, justifying war for a believing Christian, knowing, right, that the sixth commandment: do not kill, do not murder, and turn the other cheek. Teachings of Jesus. How in the world then are you to stay religiously, spiritually, ideologically consistent and donning a uniform, holding a gun and shooting and killing people? So at any rate, that's what they did. And as far as the parameters of it, you are going to have, okay, good. Welcome, Joanna. Make sure I have your names. All right. And so certain days, certain holy days in which you can't fight, and certain special times, the manner by which you fight. And that kind of constitutes the two categories. It's casus belli and jus ad bellum are the names of the two categories. The reason for which you fight ought to be just, and the manner by which you fight ought to be just as well, for it to constitute a just war and for you to be able to answer to your Christian God without fear of condemnation after having killed people in battle. So at any rate, as far as the undergirding philosophy of it, to me, a lot of it is the word I have down here eventually. Let's see here. Chivalric. The medieval code of chivalry is pretty big on here, right? Like noblesse, let's see here. Noblesse oblige, right? The nobleman's obligation. It's the notion, right, that wherever strength that you do have and you're able to manifest, you are to use it in defense of your fellow man, in favor of the weak against the strong, as a sense of your chivalric duty to God, to country, to your fellow man, etc. And so, as you could easily guess, a just war might constitute a case in which one country or people or civilization invades another unjustly without cause, but simply to aggrandize their resources, to just gain more out of greed or out of just pure covetousness of wanting some type of resource that the other people has. And it would constitute a just war and going and defending that victim country, right, against the bully. So at any rate, and then the manner by which you fight, mainly, so much of it, it seems to me, is about discrimination and proportionality. Discrimination, you have to discriminate. You have to decide and discern in what cases the act of killing someone is justified. And of course, that constitutes when there's an actual declared war by at least two different countries or societies, and they don a uniform and they go out to fight in battle, and they have not surrendered, but are coming, to fight you, to kill you. Then, of course, you have the right to kill them first. But if they quit, if they surrender, and they no longer pose a threat to you, you are no longer, exonerated from the accusation of murder, the indictment of murder, if you kill that person. If the person never even entered the battle, did not don a uniform, does not carry a weapon, you have as late as the Civil War people coming to picnic to watch the first Battle of Bull Run. And so you have, someone who's not a combatant, an official combatant. You are to discriminate and say, no, I'm not going to harm that person, right? So in addition to discrimination is proportionality. And to me, the idea is, right, is probably a crude example, is if there were to be a raid, a small scale raid, like for instance with Pancho Villa in the early 1900s, when he engaged in a raid on Columbus, New Mexico. And he went after the military barracks there, and people rose up from the town against him and his entourage, his raiding party, and they killed about 21 people, right? You don't, in retaliation, drop a plutonium or a hydrogen bomb on Mexico itself because of this small raid by Pancho Villa across. I know that's kind of hyperbole, but it still fits. Is that notion of proportionality? You don't get any more ruthless than you have to. All right. So those are some of the undergirding, values, beliefs of this just war doctrine. So number one, if you've had the chance to read it yet, it's court history, right? We're the good guys in World War II on section number 1. You see in red right here. Because fascism virtually represents, practices, and extols or praises all that which is seen as abominable to Western civilization since the Enlightenment, and because such fascist countries sought to forcefully dominate the world and impose such a dangerous political system on all conquered nations, the US and her eventual allies of Britain and France had to fight righteously against this evil onslaught. So what I try to do is dissect the basics of fascism and show how it is inherently dangerous and inimical to what Western civilization from early modern to the modern era have come to esteem, right? To highly value and expect, etc. So with the Enlightenment, you think of things like the social contract. Government's authority over you derives from the people's consent, right? So popular sovereignty. The notion of natural rights, the individual being entitled, having been created by God, is entitled to the dignity of humanity and the rights that ought to come from that status. And so you have natural rights, you have constitutionalism or the rule of law, where you don't want to be under the arbitrary power of one man or one woman, one type of dictator or autocratic ruler, but instead, right, you want a written constitution that is the ultimate authority over the people by their consent, of course, so that it is non-discriminatory. It's not arbitrary. It doesn't change its mind and go back and forth inconsistently. And then, of course, it's supposed to have Enlightenment components within that Constitution, such as like a Bill of Rights. And another notion, right, that's popular in the Enlightenment is Montesquieu and his notions of checks and balances, that there should not be a single individual, there should not be a single faction of people who share the same self-interest or beliefs or ideology, that should be able to do simply whatever it pleases, right? That there ought to be checks to that faction, that politician's power and autonomy to do what he or she wants. And it's to prevent tyranny, right? So we have the system of checks and balances that you're familiar with here in our federal republic, our constitutional federal republic here in the US. And then, of course, you have in the 1800s, the Enlightenment was like the 1740s, mid to late 1770s, etc. The classical liberalism, I think of like John Stuart Mill, it is all about individual autonomy, that you ought to be free to listen to your own obnoxious music as loudly as you want, wear whatever offensive clothing with offensive statements written on that clothing that you want, stand in the middle of a crowd at a public, context and be able to say something that is abrasive and offensive to most of the people listening to you, standing around you. But that is your God-given right to do those things. And oftentimes the only limit that they put on the classical liberals of the 1800s, like Mill, was kind of summarized by Oliver Wendell Holmes of the US. He stated, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins." Right? So think about that. You're free to do whatever you want until you infringe upon my rights. Then you've gone too far. But until then, you're free to do your thing, individual autonomy. So when you think about those types of things, then you look at fascism, you can make the argument that fascism is almost the antithesis of those types of political traditions and ideas that we have come to hold dearly. With fascism, right, the individual means nothing. Just like the fasci is a straw, a bundle of straw that is tightly tied together, and it's symbolic, right? That one little piece of straw can be easily broken, but when they're bundled together en masse, right, you can't break it. And so with fascism, the individual, what you or I want to do, what you or I believe, the manner by which you and I want to behave, it's far from classical liberalism. Like I said, in some ways, it's the opposite of it. Is they don't care. That's not relevant. And it sure as heck isn't seen to be a natural right that you or I ought to have. But instead, right, the individual is one piece of the human body that makes up the whole body politic, the whole republic, the whole country. Is that you and I might be the pinky finger of the symbolic human body that is our country. You might be the bicep, you might be the brains, you might be whatever other part, with this type of human body metaphor. But the idea is, right, is the hand can't do its own thing. And tell the rest of the body, good luck, I'm going on my own sovereign path. But no, instead, right, it's vital for the whole body to function according to fascists. Each body has to be each part of the body part needs to be in concert with the other parts. They need to be in harmony. But the problem is how in the world are you going to, achieve harmony when, like the Federalist Papers written by Madison and others state, right, that human beings are absolutely innately programmed to disagree with one another, to argue and contend with one another, that it's sown in our nature. And that also comes from the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches later, that of original sin, that people are sinful and they're programmed to fight with one another and disagree with one another, etc. So how does fascism face that reality or that contention? Is fascism says we're going to force them to be in unity, right? So fascism is okay with coercion, with forcing parts of the body politic to quote cooperate with other parts, right? And so the individual and his or her right to go his or her own path, much less to be able to protest the government and try to go against, contend against what the government's up to, there's no toleration for that. There's no room for it in fascism, and there's no toleration for it as well. And then you get the writings of social Darwinists and Friedrich Nietzsche that were largely imbibed by Adolf Hitler and fascist leaders of European fascist countries like Italy and Germany. And they contend that, life is about dynamic expansion, that if you don't move, you die, right? And so the sense that it is the natural way of things to eat or be eaten, right? Survival of the fittest. And so the fascists took that as an axiom, as an assumption that you don't even question. And so at any rate, there is a sense that they adhered to the very morally dubious claim that might makes right. Whoever's the strongest is going to prevail. And that's the way nature intends it to be. And so you have that kind of Darwinian part to fascism that's scary also, of the strong gobbling up the weak. Okay. And then not to mention the notion internationally of expanding by force, bullying, conquering other countries and peoples, right? Which we call imperialism. And so all of that is embraced by fascism. And then, by the way, as far as harmony, as far as the nation dynamically moving in a power enriching direction, who gets to facilitate this? Who decides, right? Who is the ultimate head of the brain, if you will, of the body that tells the rest of the body what to do? And they were for an autocratic leader. They were for a one-man, political leader who was not to be questioned, to whom all allegiance was owed, and would not tolerate any rivals or claimants to his or her position, or even rivals in making room for themselves in the decision-making process. So they generically called him Der Führer, the leader, Adolf Hitler, El Duce. They called Benito Mussolini in Italy, and you didn't question them. You didn't question what they said, what they wanted. They had this almost alleged, mystical quality to them, whereby they were supposed to almost mystically know what was best for the country and the destiny that was awaiting it. And that's scary stuff, that type of cult of personality. And so fascism was all for these things. And so you see it play out in the 1930s, where they start banning other political parties. They start assassinating political rivals. They shut down oppositional political newspapers. And they just don't tolerate anyone or any collective entity that challenges what they're up to, what they want to do. And then, of course, you see it not only, domestically, but internationally. In World War II, you can make the argument that it was the imperialism of these fascist countries that primarily triggered World War II. As you may know, Adolf Hitler was angry with the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I because it was so punitive toward Germany. And he began defying one aspect of that treaty after another, one policy after another. And we just kind of, the League of Nations just kind of sat back and let him do it, kind of impotently and frighteningly. And so at any rate, he is going to eventually, say, okay, I want the port of Danzig from Poland. I want the Sudetenland from this new country, Czechoslovakia, because he said there were primarily Germans living there, and that was their historic land. And so I want the Rhineland back and militarized and kick the international troops out between England and France. And so he began just grabbing one territory after another, and they warn him, don't do it again. Don't do it again. He even promises not to do it again after he gets the Sudetenland from the Czech Republic, or back then Czechoslovakia. And so at any rate, he he went a step further and took all of Czechoslovakia. And then they said, okay, they drew a second line and said, okay, that's it. Absolutely no more. And then he went beyond the port of Danzig and invaded Poland itself. And then with the Japanese, right, it was, Korea by 1905. It was Manchuria before and after that. It was, they even tried to get involved into French Indochina or Vietnam. And of course, ultimately China. And they had a bogus event known as the Mukden incident, where a train depot station blew up, and they blamed it on the Chinese and used it as a pretext to invade China itself. And so you can make the argument, right, that fascism is inherently dangerous to what Western civilization holds to be important and vital, right? And then, of course, the Holocaust, right? With Nazi Germany, with the Nuremberg laws, they began meeting. The SA began meeting and writing up an ultimate plan for Germany as far as her destiny, right, as dictated by her Führer, her leader, Adolf Hitler. And that entailed grabbing Lebensraum, or living space, from other countries. They were okay with that. But it also meant establishing a so-called homogenous people's community, whereby that we see there in red, the Volksgemeinschaft. With the people's community, you were to, they had strict criteria for being considered worthy of acceptance into the people's community. For one, they went to 1/8 of your ancestry, and you were to be German up through the second generation. You were to be pure German, whatever that means. Because remember, they contended that the Germans came from the Aryans. Remember, the Aryans took over the Dravidians in India and other places in Europe as well, and throughout Eurasia. And they were a conquering people. They brought a lot of religious and cultural innovations to the people. And so Hitler praised these historic Aryan people for their culture creating capacity, for their prowess on the military field, etc. That they were an alleged, superior people. And remember, they adhered to Darwinism, to the Darwinism of the late 1800s up to this point, right? Contending that some races of people, and remember, race is arguably a social construction, using that term now, but certain races are not as literally biologically evolved from the alleged primate origin of humanity as others are. And of course, they thought Aryans were the predecessors to the Germans, and that the Germans were the cream of the crop amongst all the human races. So at any rate, the work shy, as they called them, those who were unwilling to work and were oftentimes homeless, homosexuals, the very obstinately faithful Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, were excluded and attacked and excluded from the people's community. And the Albanian gypsies, as they were called, they decided in one infamous meeting that all Slavic people related to the Russians and the Balkan areas of Southern Europe were an inferior people, unfit for integration into the people's community. And then ultimately, right, the main demographic that they went after just viciously were the Jews, the Jewish Europeans, right? And so, I mean, you had the Night of Broken Glass, you had the Nuremberg laws, they segregated them, they took their business licenses from them, they freezed their assets, they put them in segregated ghettos. They just, it's incredible, the Holocaust story. But ultimately, right, you have a term written down from one of the meetings of the SA, I believe, whereby they used the term final solution. And the final solution was to kill anybody unworthy of integration into the people's community, literally murder them. And so as they went and invaded Russia, especially, and other sovereign countries, the Einsatzgruppen, known as the cleanup crew, they would come and kill them by the thousands, line up civilians and wounded soldiers, because as an entire people, ethnic group, and nationality, those groups, like the Russians, have been deemed as inferior, and the final solution intended to clean them up. But again, there was a just very crude fixation on Jewish Europeans in particular, as 6 million of the 12 million victims of the Holocaust were Jews. All right. I've heard on one source I've read, 2/3 of Europe's Jews. Just absolute catastrophe. So I have here, clearly the world was much better off and freer because we won, the Allies, and defeated fascism, a political ideology and system that is inherently poisonous to all things held sacred in modern Western civilization. And then you have Mussolini and Hitler, the Einsatzgruppen executing people simply because of their nationality or ethnicity. And that's Joseph Mengele. And Joseph Mengele did cruel experiments on little Jewish children at Auschwitz, at one of the infamous concentration camps, where they systematically murdered the undesirables. All right. So any questions on number one? So number one, right? Remember the two categories of just war doctrine: why you fight and how you fight. So number one is court history, and it applies to the first category of just war doctrine of why you fight. And it says, right, that fascism was, a crusade against fascism in and of itself was a worthy cause and reason for fighting. Number two is we point fingers at the Japanese and the manner by which they fought, the second category of just war doctrine, right? So you have the reasons for which you fight, and then the manner by which you fight. And now number two deals with the manner by which you fight. And again, it's court history because it's going to vilify the Japanese. Unjust Enrichment was the primary book that I used in citing this one. It's just incredible. The treatment, the alleged treatment of prisoners of war and non-combatants that the Japanese inflicted upon those whom they conquered throughout the Pacific and Asia. All right, so take a look at that. Even if you don't choose number two, please read it. All right. So you have, specific instances. They said right here, they were going to deal with prisoners of war as circumstances dictate. And the rest of the war powers, including Nazi Germany, were at least nominally following the dictates of international law and exchanging prisoners of war, giving them food and shelter, and not harming them, not enslaving them, etc. But Japanese did just that. You have the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. If you want to look further into that, that was pretty gruesome. They put them at the American and Filipino prisoners of war because we initially lost the Philippines to the Japanese in World War II. And they put them on a fast-paced jog across the peninsula, the Bataan Peninsula. And those who could not keep step, they simply bayoneted and killed on the spot. Some they even arbitrarily, supposedly pulled out from the lines and killed just to terrorize and strike fear into the other prisoners of war. You have the Marus Maru episode where Allied soldiers who had been torpedoed, tried to climb up into a Japanese boat, and the Japanese ship, they killed they killed these prisoners of war. And let's see here. So this is all part of the old school court history of vilifying the fascist countries. And Matsunaga, he boasted about exploiting and enslaving prisoners of war with his famous Burma Road or Burma Railroad. All right. So take a look at these, if you would, in your own time. But pretty straightforward thesis. Then number 3 also deals with the second category of the manner by which you fight, right? And this now is revisionist history, whereby it's contending that the U.S. did not necessarily fight in just war doctrine fashion, that we hit below the belt as well. All right. So one of the first things I think of is carpet bombing, bombing civilian targets in Germany and Japan, also in Bulgaria, Romania, and other countries as well that were occupied by the Nazi regime. And so what was the term? It was like IWD-1 or something like that, IWT or IWD-1. And they decided to put a system intact as to regarding points, a point system, as to the desirability of a given city in Germany or Japan being attacked aerially from above by bombers, right? So you could infer this, you could make an educated guess, and I'm sure and get it right. Is for one, if it's contributing to the war effort. So if you have war factories making guns, tanks, etc., ammunition, right? Then that's worth a high number of points. And thus, if that city accrues a certain number of points, it gets on a special list for hitting, for bombing. So Hamburg, Dresden, Dusseldorf, and other German cities, and of course, Tokyo, Japan, and others in Japan as well. But then when you look at the bombing of Romania, and when you get toward the end of the war, they no longer followed the IWD, which are IWD-1 format, which already was controversial in and of itself. And if that wasn't controversial enough, they stopped using the point system, and they started contending that they should bomb certain cities to dampen morale for the war. Yikes, right? So now they're not even pretending to hit places for their strategic, war creating capacity, war factories, etc. Now they're just hitting cities just to dampen enthusiasm in that city for the war. And obviously they're killing primarily non-combatants. They're killing, civilians. Imagine if they had done that to us. Richmond and Oakland here in the East Bay, Martinez and Vallejo, those cities in the East Bay here in California. They had plenty of, and Southern California as well, plenty of war producing, war material producing factories that a lot of Black women in particular moved into to work as riveters, etc., welding the wings to the jet planes, etc. Imagine if they bombed Oakland because they said, hey, it merited a high number of points and we're trying to, diminish their war creating capacity. And so therefore, that's why we're bombing it. And then imagine if they went a step further from that and they said, well, let's hit Sacramento. Let's hit, whatever other cities you might say closer into the Valley of California, etc. And then someone contends, wait a minute, there are no factories there. There's no nerve center as far as telecommunications. There's no really reason under IWD-1 policy to hit this city. And then they said, oh no, it's to dampen morale. is to get the people of Sacramento and elsewhere angry with their own government when their loved ones die in bombings, and eager to sue for peace and put pressure on their politicians to sue for peace out of misery. I mean, my goodness, right? We would have just been up in arms, to say the least, if the fascist countries had done that to us. But we ended up doing that to them. And then as far as the manner by which we fought, you know, sometimes real kind of Machiavellian decisions had to be made. Right here, when Operation Magic, when we broke Japanese codes system and were able to decipher what they were saying in shrouded, you know, terms, we there came a time or two in which the Japanese highly suspected, you know, because we began anticipating what they were going to do. And they're like, wait a minute, it's like they got our playbook or something. They know what we're going to do before we do it, and they prepare for it. So then, to try to mitigate their the Japanese government and military's suspicion, we stopped warning our boys. So there were cases in which we knew an attack was coming, and we deliberately did not warn the men because we wanted them to be ill prepared. We wanted them to be in disarray, to convince the Japanese that we did not have their code, and to convince them that they didn't need to change the code. So imagine being in a position to make decisions like that. There was a place called Schweinfurt, and at Schweinfurt, the bombers were used as decoys. They told the bombers some bogus claims of wanting them to bomb the city, knowing that the anti-aircraft artillery in that city was superb, knowing that a large contingent of the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, was prepared to come up and was technologically superior to the B-29, B-51, and other bombers. And they sent them basically to their death, but to lure the Luftwaffe into the air so that our famous P-51 Mustang jet fighters could take them down in the air in dogfights and not have to contend with the ground anti-aircraft artillery. So yikes, huh? Imagine having to make those types of decisions. And then ultimately, the manner by which we fought, we dropped, you guys, right, a hydrogen and a plutonium bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. When you look at the code system, I'm sorry, the point system, they did never merited a place on the list as far as military production, anything like that. So hence, they were not militarily significant targets. And they largely were pristine. They hadn't been touched by warfare, arguably. And those are the cities that we decided to drop this new nasty bomb on. Yikes, right? When you look at some of the people in the Manhattan Project putting the bomb production together, like, you know, under Robert Oppenheimer, there was a guy named Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr was a Danish physicist who Oppenheimer was greatly dependent upon his brains, picking his brains of how to best split an atom and what type of element atom to create, you know, marvelous destructive power. And Niels Bohr, oftentimes, he refused to come to New Mexico at Los Alamos, where they were putting the bomb together and experimenting. And when he was called on by Oppenheimer, he would oftentimes answer him in vague terms, almost in riddles, for the sake of his own conscience, evidently. He didn't want to overtly tell Oppenheimer how to create this bomb. And why is that, right? He knew once the US had it, it likely was going to use it. And it was going to take a lot of human lives. And matter of fact, there was a petition by many of the scientists at Los Alamos contending that they wanted the scientific community and the American people to have a say in the utilization or use of this bomb. They didn't want the military and the president as commander in chief to have sole arbitrary power on how and when and in what ways to use this bomb. But of course, that's what happened. The president, his joint chiefs of staff, his National Security Council got together and decided that it was necessary to drop these bombs on Japan. Now, when you look at the civilian government of Japan, they were making overtures to consider peace. That seems to be a fact. But the point is, by the other side of the spectrum, is they contend that, well, the civilian leaders weren't in control, and as long as the military leaders still wanted to fight, the fight was still going to happen, and they were not going to surrender. And we insisted that the emperor step down, and that they unconditionally surrender. And to some people, they contend to this day that we didn't have to be so demanding in what we asked of the Japanese government by the end of World War II. Some people say that we could have put a cordon around them, like a blockade, a naval blockade around the Japanese islands, and could have starved them into submission. Some people contend that we could have brought them to Los Alamos, New Mexico, or to the Bikini Atolls of the Pacific, and could have shown the Japanese the power of the bomb without actually using it on human victims to convince them to surrender. And so this has been in discourse to this day. But of course, what Truman is going to contend is that it was necessary because of the alleged fanaticism of the Japanese under the code of Bushido, the samurai code, and the notion of death before dishonor. And then he pointed out some of the worst islands where the fighting had been very, very suicidally stubborn. There's a place called Tarawa. There's a place called Peleliu. Of course, Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and a place called Saipan. Look up any of those places, and the number of Japanese defenders, the percentage of Japanese defenders that actually eventually surrendered was tiny, very minuscule. Most of them fought to the death. So he contended, right, that such a drastic move was necessary against such a stubbornly obstinate enemy in Japan. So number 3 is revisionist history, contending that we didn't fight the war in a just manner. And then number 4 goes back to the first category, that we didn't fight for the right reasons. Okay, number 4, revisionist history as well, contending that we did not fight for the right reasons. For one, did we fight to end the Holocaust? There's plenty of evidence to suggest that we did not, right? Look up a guy named Breckinridge Long. The State Department had ample evidence of the Holocaust and did nothing about it. What was it? The St. Louis ship had runaway Jewish immigrants that made it to the American coast, begging to receive refuge, asylum, and we sent them back to Europe. We said no. We could have arguably bombed the railroad tracks to Auschwitz and Dachau and these other horrible death camps, and we didn't. So, as far as fighting for that, then we contended, right, in the famous Atlantic Charter, Churchill and FDR contended they were fighting for the dignity and the rights of all human beings. Well, if we were, then why did we segregate our Black troops still? Right? Under World War II, Black troops still fought in segregated units under white commanders, right? Why were Jim Crow laws still in effect back here in our country if we were fighting for the dignity of all human beings against fascism, right? Why did we have such malicious conflict with Latinos or Hispanic Americans? We're going to go over pretty soon the Zoot Suit riots that occurred during World War II, and it was ugly and laden with anti-Hispanic sentiment. And And then, of course, Executive Order 9066, the internment of between 110 and 120,000 Japanese American and Japanese immigrant people. And Fred Korematsu sued the government and contended that he should not be placed in an internment camp, nor anybody else in his category, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, because he was born here. And remember, the 14th Amendment at the beginning of this semester with Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War states anyone born or naturalized in any of the states is guaranteed all the rights, privileges, protections of citizenship. But he lost. The Supreme Court said that in a state of war, it constituted an exceptional time for an exceptional category of laws to be implemented, and that it was of military necessity to keep those of Japanese origin supervised, watched, segregated, because there was fear that they were going to be the proverbial fifth column, the help from within against us. After, of course, Pearl Harbor. At the internment camps, I always forget, I get the two mixed up. There's Tule Lake and there's Tulare. One of the two sent the troublemakers into that camp, the Japanese who were non-cooperative, mainly young men. And a lot of them were Japanese Americans, technically citizens under the 14th Amendment. And you had an uprising there. Guards shot at the people and they killed a handful of inmates. So yes, we didn't systematically murder 12 million undesirables like the German Nazis did, but we took lives of Japanese Americans, however small number, arguably one is too many. And we killed a handful at one of those two places. It was either Tule Lake, or Tulare. I apologize, I can't recall at the moment. So they were told, right? Please take all which you can carry and evacuate your homes and report to the local authorities as soon as possible. And take a look at any kind of documentary in nearby Merced, California. They put the Japanese in internment camp on the fairgrounds, the Merced Fairgrounds, and they do a commemoration of that awful experience to this day once a year in Merced. So were we really fighting for the right reasons? And this one, right, rhetorically says no. And you look at the treatment of African-American women. There's an interesting book called Abiding Courage about African-American women moving into Oakland and Richmond to work in the war industry. And the manner by which they treated was awful, to say the least. All right, so any questions? All right. Can I get a thumbs up that you guys have been able to hear me, that you followed me, that you got a pretty decent grasp? Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. A decent grasp of this material. Isn't this interesting? And I'm not talking about my coverage of it. I'm talking about just in and of itself, the topic itself. Isn't World War II interesting? So let me take a quick look at the questions. The popular narrative linking the Treaty of Versailles to World War II highlights the excessively lenient terms given to Germany. No, the highly punitive terms given to Germany, right? So fascism, number 2, just war theory and modern liberalism condemned Germany for what reasons? I've covered 3, I believe. Number 4 looks like it's been covered. As I believe number 5 has. But if I'm wrong, let me know. If you have a question. I just covered number 6. But let's take a look at number 7. Allied victory in World War II was abetted by. How was it helped? Us winning World War II. Cracking the enemy's codes? Absolutely. It was called Ultra, breaking the German code, and it was called Magic, breaking the Japanese code. Some of Hitler's unilateral decisions, like attacking the Soviet Union before he had defeated Great Britain, yes. Failing to attack Normandy more decisively on our famous D-Day, absolutely. D-Day was June 6, 1944. That's when we opened up a Western front and sandwiched the Germans, fighting them on the west periphery of Europe, and the Russians pushing them back from the east. Eventual industrial and air superiority, absolutely. We won the skies in both the Pacific against the Japanese and in the Atlantic or in Europe against the Germans. Heroic and tenacious fighting at places like Stalingrad, that was the Russians fighting there. Bastogne, and that was known as the Battle of the Bulge, where we held on a German very desperate counterattack. Guadalcanal, when we finally stemmed the tide of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. You can look up Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Solomon Islands. Leyte Gulf was in the Philippines, and that was a brutal naval battle. And Okinawa was a brutal land battle on that island, just outside the Japanese islands. So all of those are true. And I'm sorry, did someone have a comment or question?
Oh, no, I was just going to answer the question and say that it was all of the above.
That's right. Good for you. Good for you. All right. So I take it you've done some reading before this, because I didn't really cover that yet. I had not covered that yet. So I'm proud of you for being familiar with those basics. All right. So any other comments or questions before we call it a day?
Will you upload this video on the modules?
Absolutely. Okay. Yes. Yeah, I'll aim to do it this evening. Okay. I have more Zoom videos after this, and I'll aim at posting it this evening. All right.
When we have our second test or this test?
So I'll be sure to post this as well. I may not have posted this yet. So these are the 7 questions on test 3 on your final test, right? That will pertain to today's topic, this week's topic of World War II.
Will there be a like final schedule or something like that for this class?
No, no. I mean, it just really the final is no different in many dimensions from just being test 3. It won't be a cumulative. I test you once on a topic, and to me that's good enough. And yeah, it'll be the last week of the semester. You'll have to do it. Okay. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Okay. You guys have a great week, and I'm happy to give you your extra credit points. Thank you for showing up. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye, Giselle.